August 1942. The mood in the Imperial Japanese Army officers' mess in Rabaul was not just confident, it was euphoric. For 6 months, the empire of the rising sun had swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave. They had humiliated the British in Singapore, crushed the Dutch in the East Indies, and driven the Americans out of the Philippines. To the hardened veterans of the Imperial Army, the Western soldier was a joke. They called them Ronin, masterless samurai without honor. The Japanese propaganda machine painted a vivid picture of the American GI. He was a soft, spoiled boy who needed ice cream, jazz music, and air conditioning to survive. He was a traitor, not a warrior. He relied on machines because he lacked seishin, spiritual strength. One sharp thrust of the bayonet, a Japanese captain wrote in his diary, and the Americans will throw up their hands and surrender. They cannot fight in the dark. They cannot fight in the rain. They are weak. This was the myth that Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki carried with him when he landed on Guadalcanal. Ichiki was a legend, a firebrand commander who had helped start the war in China. When he arrived on the dark sands of Guadalcanal with his elite detachment of 900 men, he didn't wait for reinforcements. He didn't wait for artillery. He didn't even bother to scout the American lines properly. Why would he? He was facing Americans. He believed that a single terrifying night attack, a traditional Banzai charge, would send the terrified Marines running back to their boats. He was wrong. Dead wrong. On the night of August 21, at the mouth of the Tanaru River, the myth of the soft American died in a hail of gunfire. Ichiki's men surged out of the coconut grove, screaming Banzai and Marine, you die. They expected panic. They expected the undisciplined fire of frightened men. Instead, they ran into a wall of discipline and cold, calculated violence. The Marines of the 1st Division didn't run. They didn't flinch. They had dug in, sighted their water-cooled heavy machine guns, and waited. As the first wave of Japanese infantry hit the sandbar, the American line erupted. But it wasn't just the machine guns that shocked the Japanese. It was the brutality. The Marines unleashed 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister shot, essentially giant shotgun shells filled with hundreds of steel balls. The effect was devastating. It shredded the Japanese ranks, turning the disciplined formation into a slaughterhouse. The Japanese soldiers, raised on the belief that their spirit could overcome steel, found themselves charging into a meat grinder. When they tried to flank through the ocean surf, the Americans didn't retreat. They stood up in their foxholes and fired rifles, threw grenades, and engaged in vicious hand-to-hand combat. The soft Americans were using knives, entrenching tools, and bare hands. They fought with a savage intensity that matched the Japanese fury step for step. By morning, the sandbar at the mouth of the Tanaru was choked with bodies. Colonel Ichiki's detachment had been annihilated. Over 700 of his 900 men were dead. The survivors were stunned, wandering in the jungle, bleeding and broken. A Japanese survivor later wrote, "We thought they were merchants. We thought they were soft. But at the Tanaru, we met demons. They did not break. They did not run. They simply killed." The battle was small in the scale of the war, but the psychological impact was massive. The Japanese high command realized with horror that the propaganda was a lie. The enemy was not soft. The enemy was well-fed, well-equipped, and terrifyingly aggressive. The jungle of Guadalcanal had just taught the empire a bloody lesson. The sleeping giant was awake, and he knew how to fight. September 1942, the Matanikau River sector, Guadalcanal. The jungle was a living thing, and it wanted them dead. It wasn't just the heat or the rot, it was the claustrophobia. Visibility was cut to 5 yards. A man could be standing right in front of you, hidden by a wall of elephant grass, and you wouldn't know until his bayonet was in your chest. For the Japanese infantry, this dense tangle was an ally. It was their home. For the Marines of the 1st Division, it was a nightmare. The long, heavy M1 Garans were clumsy in the tight brush. You couldn't swing them fast enough. But Sergeant Bull Miller didn't carry a Garand. He carried a Winchester Model 1897. It was a relic from the trenches of the First World War, a pump-action 12-gauge shotgun with an exposed hammer and a perforated heat shield over the barrel. The Marines called it the trench sweeper. The Japanese called it a war crime. "Keep it tight," Miller whispered, sweat dripping from his nose onto the walnut stock of the shotgun. The patrol moved slowly. Suddenly, the jungle erupted. "Banzai!" 3 Japanese soldiers burst from a spider hole covered in palm fronds, screaming, bayonets fixed. They were 10 feet away. A rifleman would have been dead. He would have missed the first shot or been too slow to cycle the bolt. Miller didn't aim. He pointed. He slammed the slide back and forth. The Model 1897 had a unique, terrifying feature. It had no trigger disconnector. If you held the trigger down and pumped the slide, it fired as fast as you could pump. Boom, clack, clack. Boom, clack, clack. Boom. In 2 seconds, Miller unleashed 3 rounds of 00 buckshot. Each shell held 9 .33 caliber lead pellets. It was like firing a submachine gun that hit with the force of a sledgehammer. The 3 attackers were lifted off their feet. The buckshot shredded the vegetation and the men behind it. There was no finesse. There was only raw, kinetic destruction. Silence returned to the trail, ringing in their ears. "Jesus, Sarge," a private whispered, staring at the carnage. To the Japanese, this was terrifying. Their philosophy of Bushido valued precision, spirit, and the steel of the sword. The shotgun was none of those things. It was an industrial tool of erasure. Captured Japanese diaries revealed a deep, shaking fear of the automatic exploding stick. It didn't wound, it removed. But if the shotgun was the terror of the patrol, the flamethrower was the terror of the siege. 2 days later, the company hit a bunker complex near the coast. These weren't hasty foxholes. These were masterpieces of defensive engineering. Coconut logs stacked 3 deep, reinforced with coral and sand, buried under the earth. Machine gun fire raked the Marine lines. Grenades bounced off the logs harmlessly. 37mm anti-tank rounds just embedded themselves in the wood. "Bring up the heat!" the captain yelled. PFC Tony Russo waddled forward. He was carrying 70 pounds of hail on his back. The M1A1 flamethrower tanks were heavy, awkward, and made him a walking bomb. If a sniper bullet hit the tanks, he was dead. "Cover me!" Russo screamed. The squad opened up with everything they had, suppressing the firing slits of the bunker. Russo scrambled over the deadfall, his boots slipping in the mud. He got to within 20 yards of the blind side of the bunker. He felt the weight of the wand in his hands. He took a deep breath, smelling the distinct odor of Hexton gasoline. He squeezed the rear trigger to ignite the hydrogen pilot light at the nozzle. Then he stepped around the corner, facing the bunker's aperture. He squeezed the front trigger. Whoosh! A stream of liquid fire, burning at 2,000 degrees, arced through the air. It looked like a solid orange rod. It splashed against the logs and poured through the firing slit like water. The screaming that came from inside the bunker was unlike anything the Marines had heard in combat. It wasn't a battle cry. It was the primal shriek of men being consumed. The fire sucked the oxygen out of the air. It cooked the ammunition inside the bunker, causing it to pop and explode. Russo shut off the valve. The bunker was silent. save for the crackling of burning wood. Smoke, black and oily, rolled out of the slit. No one came out. The Japanese soldier had been told that his spirit was armor. He had been told that the Americans were weak. But as they watched their comrades fall to the trench sweeper and their fortresses turn into ovens, a new, cold reality set in. Spirit could not stop buckshot. Honor could not burn. The Americans had brought the fires of industry to the jungle, and they were burning the empire down, one bunker at a time. September 12th, 1942, Lunga Ridge. The ridge rose like a spine above the jungle floor, a grassy knoll that protected the vital Henderson Field airstrip. To the Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, it was just a muddy hill. To Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi and his brigade of 3,000 hardened Japanese infantry, it was the throat of the American invasion. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of impending violence. Kawaguchi didn't just plan an attack, he planned an execution. His philosophy was rooted in the ancient code of Bushido. He believed with absolute conviction that the American soldier was spiritually hollow. They were factory workers in uniform, dependent on their supply lines and their machines. Take away their comfort, scream in their faces in the dark, and charge them with the cold steel of a bayonet, and they would crumble. The bullet is foolish, the Japanese officers told their men. The bayonet is smart. They believed in Seishin, spiritual power. They believed that a sufficient amount of willpower could bend reality, that a wave of screaming men could override the physics of ballistics. At 2100 hours, the jungle exploded. A red flare arched into the black sky, hissing as it burned. From the tree line at the base of the ridge, a sound rose that made the blood of the young Marines turn to ice. It started as a low rumble and swelled into a terrifying collective shriek. "Tenno Heika Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!" 2,000 men surged out of the darkness. They didn't use cover. They didn't flank. They ran straight up the grassy slope, shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed, officers waving katanas over their heads. It was a tidal wave of human flesh, driven by a spiritual certainty that they were invincible. Waiting for them at the top of the ridge was not a group of frightened boys. It was a machine. "Commence firing," Edson roared. The American response was not spiritual. It was industrial. The ridge erupted in a blinding strobe light of muzzle flashes. The Marines had dug in their heavy Browning 1917 water-cooled machine guns. These weapons were designed to fire indefinitely, as long as the water jackets were kept full and the ammunition belts kept feeding. They began to traverse the slope, back and forth, like a scythe cutting wheat. The first wave hit the wall of lead and simply evaporated. Men were cut in half. The spirit that drove them forward collided with the mathematics of kinetic energy. A 150-grain bullet, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, did not care about honor. It did not care about the emperor. It only cared about physics. But the Japanese kept coming. They climbed over the bodies of the first wave. They climbed over the bodies of the second wave. Then the Americans unleashed their secret weapon, the 105mm howitzers back at the airfield. The artillery observers on the ridge called down the fire. "Drop it 5-0. Fire for effect." The shells screamed overhead and detonated less than 200 yards in front of the American positions. But the terrifying part wasn't the explosion, it was the fragmentation. The Americans were also using 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister shot, giant shotgun shells filled with steel balls.
When the canister rounds fired, they turned the jungle into a meat grinder. The steel balls shredded the vegetation, the uniforms, and the bodies of the charging soldiers. The noise was apocalyptic. The screaming of the Banzai charge was drowned out by the mechanical rhythm of the machine guns and the thunder of the artillery. Japanese Lieutenant Takeshi, leading his platoon up the slope, watched in horror as his unit was dismantled. He had told his men that the Americans would run. He had told them that the Western spirit was weak. But the Americans weren't running. They were standing up in their foxholes, throwing grenades, shouting curses, and firing their weapons until the barrels glowed red hot. They were fighting with a savage, stubborn ferocity that the Japanese manual said didn't exist. By 0300 hours, the attacks began to falter. The slope of Lunga Ridge was carpeted with the dead. The human wave had crashed against the steel wall and shattered. When the sun rose over Guadalcanal the next morning, the scene was horrific. Over 800 Japanese bodies lay in heaps on the grass. The Marines, exhausted, bleeding but alive, looked down at the carnage. Kawaguchi's brigade was broken, but more importantly, the myth was broken. The Banzai charge, the ultimate expression of Japanese military spirit, had failed. It hadn't just failed, it had been suicidal. A surviving Japanese officer, retreating into the jungle, wrote in his diary, "We attacked with the spirit of the samurai. They defended with the spirit of the machine. The machine won. Their firepower is not just a weapon, it is a force of nature. We cannot fight this with courage alone." The Battle of Bloody Ridge was the turning point where the Japanese soldier realized that his enemy was not soft. The Americans had turned the jungle into a killing field, and no amount of screaming Banzai could stop the rain of steel. The age of the samurai was over. The age of industrial warfare had arrived.
October 1942. The Matanakau River Valley. Private First Class Tanaka moved through the jungle like smoke. He was a veteran of the China campaign, a master of night infiltration. The Japanese Army doctrine taught that the night was their greatest ally. The Americans, they were told, were terrified of the dark. They were loud, clumsy, and blind. They huddled in their holes, praying for the sun, firing blindly at shadows. Tanaka's mission was simple: penetrate the American lines, slit the throats of the sentries, and locate the heavy mortar positions. He moved on his hands and knees, feeling the ground for dry twigs before placing his weight. He was invisible. He was a ghost. But on this night, the jungle felt different. Usually, he could smell the Americans, the sweet scent of their tobacco, the heavy odor of their tinned beef, the metallic tang of gun oil. Tonight, the air was clean. Usually, he could hear them, the clinking of canteens, the whisper of passwords, the shifting of boots in the mud. Tonight, there was only the sound of the rain dripping from the canopy. Tanaka paused behind the root of a massive banyan tree. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The silence was wrong. It wasn't the silence of an empty forest. It was the silence of a held breath. He didn't know it, but the enemy had changed. The U.S. Marines of the 1st Division were no longer the green boys who had landed in August. They had learned. They had adapted. They had stopped smoking at night. They had taped their dog tags together to stop the jingling. They had smeared their faces with burnt cork and mud. They had learned to hunt. Tanaka crept forward another 10 yards. He was looking for the silhouette of a helmet against the sky. He was looking for the glow of a cigarette. Instead, he found a tripwire. He felt it brush against his shin, a thin black thread strung ankle-high. He froze. If he had been a rookie, he would have pulled back, but Tanaka knew that a tripwire meant a booby trap or a noisemaker. He carefully stepped over it. He smiled in the dark. Amateurs, he thought. They rely on strings because they cannot watch. He took one more step, and the jungle floor beneath him exploded, not with fire, but with motion. From the very mud he was crawling on, a shape rose up. It wasn't a machine, it was a man. A Marine had been lying in a spider hole, a camouflaged pit dug forward of the main lines for 6 hours. He hadn't moved, he hadn't slept, he urinated in his pants rather than risk the noise of crawling away. Tanaka didn't have time to unsheath his bayonet. The Marine didn't fire his weapon. A gunshot would give away the position of the listening post, or LP. Instead, there was the dull, wet thud of a shovel edge hitting bone. Tanaka reeled back, gasping, his hand reaching for his rifle. Then a second shadow detached itself from the tree trunk to his left. He hadn't even seen it. It was another Marine, face black as coal, holding a K-bar knife. The violence was sudden, brutal, and silent. There were no screams, only the sounds of struggle in the mud, the grunts of exertion, the tearing of cloth, the snapping of twigs. Within seconds, it was over. Tanaka lay dying in the dirt, looking up at the canopy. The last thing he saw wasn't a terrified American conscript. It was a pair of eyes staring down at him, eyes that held no fear of the dark. The Marine wiped his knife on his pant leg and sank back into the shadows, disappearing completely. Tanaka's final thought was a realization that terrified him more than death itself. The propaganda was a lie. The Americans weren't huddled in their bunkers anymore. They weren't waiting to be killed. They were out here in the dark with knives and shovels. They had become the jungle. The Japanese command back at Rabaul would never receive Tanaka's report, but the survivors of other patrols brought back the same whispered horror stories. The Americans had developed devil dogs, special units and raiders who moved like ghosts, who set ambushes in the blackest parts of the forest, and who fought with a savagery that rivaled the samurai. The night no longer belonged to the emperor. The soft Americans had learned the language of the jungle, and their vocabulary was death. The hunters had become the hunted.
January 1943. The jungle was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. To the Americans, the island was simply Guadalcanal. But to the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese 17th Army, it had earned a new, terrified name. They took the characters for the island's name, Guadalcanal, and shortened it to 2 grim syllables, Gato. In Japanese, Gato means Starvation Island. Private First Class Sato sat against the rotting trunk of a palm tree near Cape Esperance. He was 22 years old, but he looked 80. His uniform hung off his frame like rags on a scarecrow. His ribs were clearly visible through his skin, his eyes sunken deep into his skull, rimmed with the yellow tint of jaundice and malaria. He held a handful of moss in his trembling hand. This was his dinner. "Eat it," whispered the soldier next to him, a man whose legs were so swollen from beriberi that he could no longer walk. "It stops the pain." Sato chewed the bitter green sludge. It tasted of dirt and failure. 6 months ago, they had landed as conquerors. They were the emperor's chosen warriors, destined to sweep the Westerners into the sea. Now they were scavengers. They ate lizards. They ate roots. They boiled their leather belts to make broth. When the hunger became unbearable, some whispered that they had looked at the bodies of the dead with a dark, forbidden hunger. But the starvation was only half the terror. The true horror was the realization of what they were up against. A week earlier, Sato had been on a patrol near the American perimeter. Through his binoculars, he had seen something that broke his spirit more than any bomb. He saw a bulldozer. The Americans weren't just fighting, they were building. He saw trucks unloading mountains of crates, Spam, chocolate, cigarettes, quinine, fresh socks, ammunition. He saw them paving the mud with steel mats to land their planes. He saw them drinking ice water. Sato looked down at his own rifle, pitted with rust, and his empty ammunition pouch. He realized then that Japan had lost. They weren't fighting an army, they were fighting an industrial god. The Americans could pave the jungle, they could air-condition the war. Japan could not even feed its own men. They are monsters, Sato thought, not because they are fierce, but because they have everything. By late January, the order finally came. It wasn't called a retreat. That word was forbidden in the Imperial Army. It was called a transfer of forces. But everyone knew the truth. They were running away. Operation K began under the cover of darkness. The Tokyo Express, fast destroyers daring the American waters, slipped into the bay at night to rescue the survivors. The scene on the beach at Cape Esperance was a vision of hell. Thousands of skeletal men, using their rifles as crutches, hobbled toward the boats. The sick and the wounded who couldn't walk were left behind. Some were given a grenade and an order, "Do not be captured." Sato dragged his friend toward the surf. The destroyers were waiting, dark shapes against the stars. The sailors on the boats looked at the soldiers with horror. They pulled up men who weighed less than 80 pounds. They pulled up living ghosts. "Leave me," his friend wheezed, collapsing in the sand. "I cannot make it." "You must," Sato hissed, tears cutting through the dirt on his face. "We are going home." But as he looked around, he saw the truth of Gato. The jungle floor was littered with the equipment they had carried with such pride. Machine guns, mortars, helmets, flags. It was all abandoned. The beach was a monument to the death of the imperial dream. Sato was hauled onto the deck of the destroyer Isokaze. He was handed a ball of rice, real white rice. He stared at it, unable to comprehend the sight of food. He ate it slowly, feeling the life return to his veins, but the shame burned hotter than the malaria. As the destroyer pulled away, cutting through the black water, Sato looked back at the dark silhouette of Guadalcanal. 30,000 Japanese soldiers had died there. They had died from bullets, yes, but mostly they had died from hubris. They had died because their leaders believed that spirit could replace logistics. The Americans had taken the island, they had taken the airfield, and in doing so, they had taken the Japanese soul. Sato closed his eyes, the taste of rice and defeat in his mouth. The war would go on for 2 more years. The killing would get worse. But for the men who survived Gato, the war was already over. They knew in the deep, silent parts of their minds that the giant had awakened, and nothing, not courage, not sacrifice, not the emperor himself, could stop it.